Hi everyone, welcome one more time to Football Talks with Ultrax. My name is Marko Matushinsky, and today with us in our episode we have one special guest. He's coming directly from Australia. Haoson, hi, welcome here to Ultrax episodes, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me, Marco. Privileged to be here. And yeah, I actually want to give a shout out to Joe for connecting us as well. Myself and Marco, we recently met up at the first vowed return to performance conference. It was a really good conference at in Warsaw. My first time in Poland. I love the experiencing new cultures, and yeah, we were lucky enough to be connected by Joe from Global Performance Insights. So yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, glad that you mentioned Joe and about the Return to Sport conference in Poland. It was amazing. A lot of great practitioners, great topics from Joe, Martin, Daniel Cohn. So it was an amazing event. Yeah, and this is how we met. And well, I approached to you, hey man, this is interesting. Can we do an episode podcast? And well, 2 weeks
Yeah,
after
yeah,
we are here.
here we are.
And one more time, thank you for that. And yeah, let's tell the people and show the people the interesting topics that we will cover. So we will talk about people from communication, organization, something about testing, strength training methodology, but also we will cover some topics from experiences from your side, how to use the wall equipment. But before we start with it, can you give us more from your side about your background and your training philosophy? So how you start working as a coach and where you're working right now?
Perfect. So yeah, my background is, I guess, the standard S&C coach or sports practitioner sort of background, where basically failed athlete, got too many injuries, and when I was younger, and decided to really get into the more coaching and performance side of things by really understanding, training load, how to um, minimize injuries, how to optimize performance. And then from there, I started my first role. I've worked in rugby league for those that don't know. It's very similar sport to, it's like a derivative of rugby union, but played at a much faster pace compared to rugby. From there, I've also worked in a variety of different high schools in Australia, so working with more youth and adolescent athletes, and I worked in some basketball roles, and my latest role was working a lot with fighters. So I was working at a private facility in Sydney, and actually was working with as a sports scientist and also a strength and conditioning coach, working to primarily program and facilitate the sports science services
Yeah.
for different types of combat sports. And then in my current role now, I'm just working as a sports science consultant, so mainly just providing solutions to coaches for data analysis and visualization.
I don't know, man, where to start. Start talking about basketball, rugby union, or fighters. I'm all interested, in the whole three topics. Well, I'm coming mostly from football, or soccer, but I'm always interested, in how different sports are training because in the last previous few clubs that I worked, we took a lot of things from, some methodologies from fighters, some from sprint coaches, and we put it, in the team environment. So yeah, how was this for you? When you were changing from this organization to these sports, then to the individual sports. This is different when it comes to communication and organization. So what were like challenges for you? When you were changing these roles from sport to sport?
Yeah, I think in terms of like working in professional sport, so for example, I was working at the Cronulla Sharks. They had very high performance systems in place for communication, and they were, I think one thing that is important in the high performance space is like the ability to be, I guess, prompt with decisions. So ensuring that For example, my job as a sports scientist, creating reports that can be actioned immediately, basically, rather than having maybe various data sets or things like that, just sitting in the backlog, but not really being used. I think that's one of my big philosophies when it comes to using data for sports science is that, yeah, you want to ensure that whatever you're collecting is actually being used. And I think I like that analogy of like, the more you have, the more difficult it is to make decisions, right? So
For sure,
I'm
yeah.
always very careful in choosing specific things that I know that I can action straight away. Um, and in terms of like some of the challenges, I guess from the so my most recent role was in the sort of private sector. So I guess the main challenge for that is that you don't actually have that, I guess, high performance team like just there in front of you. I think that was obviously that's a big advantage when you're working in a professional club is that you're going to have all those
The whole
people,
team. Yeah,
the whole team, your physios, your SC coach, rehab coaches, they're all there. You can see them every day. But for any coaches listening who maybe working in the private sector, you have to actually build some of those relationships outside of your clinic or space. And you need to set up those good systems that allow you to communicate to these teams about a particular athlete, for example. So yeah, my job as well, I guess, even though it wasn't like a head of performance role, but working in the private sector really allowed me to actually take on some of that responsibility of being a
yeah,
head of
you
performance
are.
and actually making decisions because yeah, like no one really is going to actually initiate those networks unless you go and do it
You
yourself.
need to do
So
them. Yeah,
yeah, so yeah, I guess that's one of the biggest challenges as well. And also the when you're also working in the private sector, like most of the athletes are not full-time athletes. So for example, most fighters are going to have jobs outside of their training. So like they're training full time,
yeah.
but I'm not sure if you know, but like the pay for fighters is not great. So they have to make do with other means
The
and
work.
sometimes
Yeah,
working very physical jobs. Like most, for example, in Australia, a lot of fighters are manual laborers. So they're doing construction work. So they come in, they work up at 4, 5 a.m. in the morning, do work for 12 hours, then have to come into the gym and do some weights training. So as a coach, there's a lot of considerations that you need to take that you don't necessarily, I guess, have to manage when you're working in that professional sport environment.
yeah. Like you are alone in the whole system, so you are a jack of all trades, but you also need to put the right people in the bus so we can make better decisions, like you said. Yeah, it's I can relate to that because here in Croatia you have like female football teams or soccer teams where they are professionals, so they are getting paid for that. They have like 5 training sessions a week, one game. The whole league's professional, but still some of the players are also, like you said, they are working like for 8 hours in different scenarios. Some have, like you said, quite physical work, but you still need to program the whole thing during the sessions. So yeah, it can be quite challenging. And for this, you have a lot of experience now when you change the sports and the environment. And it get back to me for the next topic that we have here and it's about a little bit more about testing and approach to testing. And when it comes to that, what is your philosophy, when it comes to choosing the right test? Well, you can give us the example, let's say, what kind of test you use in basketball or what kind of test you use in with uh, fighters. Is there a difference or how do you approach this?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess my main philosophy when it comes to testing is that I think one of the biggest benefits of testing is it helps to inform the individualization of programming. And we know that when it comes to training athletes, we're going to have our responders and maybe sometimes non-responders, unfortunately. Like that's just how human physiology works. So one of the biggest benefits of testing is that we can firstly create some kind of profile for the athlete. We can create I guess, a picture or a story about where the athlete currently lies. And then from there, we can effectively program for the athlete a lot better, as opposed to just blindly giving a program to an athlete or to a bunch of athletes. Because, for example, if you're working in team sports, like I'm sure this doesn't happen too much, but these days, but like I guess you know you don't want to be giving the same program to 20 different athletes because yeah, they're just not going to respond in the same way as you'd expect. So you have to use testing information to identify what are the key strengths, key weaknesses, and also as well, like sometimes maybe an athlete has a recurring injury history. So you actually might need to do some extra tests to sort of screen that and see where they're currently at as well. So I guess that's the primary objective when it comes to testing for me, is that whole concept of like being able to prescribe more individualized programs from the testing data. In terms of differences between, for example, team sports and testing for fighters, yeah, like you have to again understand the demands of the sport. So before you even test,
That's it.
there's
Yeah.
a lot of things that you need to actually understand about your context, right? So, for example, fighters, sometimes I've seen fighters doing testing for like just sprinting, like doing 10, 30-meter sprints. But for me, that doesn't really make sense, right? Like fighters don't run as part of the sport. But for example, in basketball, there's obviously a lot more of that height demand in change of direction and more acceleration based demands. So that in that context, we need to actually identify the athlete's current context when it comes to those key movements. So I guess some of those differences you have to firstly go back to understanding the context of the sport and see
The sport, yeah.
what is actually relevant for what are the key physical demands that are actually relevant for the sport, and then work backwards from there and choose the tests that sort of fit within those physical skills.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And let's say I'm a strong believer now in the last, like, well, few years that, like you said, in team sports, we usually done some tests because we were above them. We didn't think about the sport, and we do it all the same with the whole team, But maybe in soccer environment, maybe goalkeepers need some extra testing procedure because the
Exactly.
position is different. Or I'm now uh, also discussing with some coaches about the approach of individualized testing. Like we can have a small battery for everyone, but depending on the player profile, maybe I need more tests for the knee, maybe I need more tests for the power, maybe I need more tests for the ankle because of his previous injuries or something like that. So like we have individualized programs, we can have also a little bit individualized testing procedures. And yeah, but it totally makes sense, and it brings me to selecting of the test. When you are testing, let's say with your athletes, and you test them. So if you need to say the specific test, what kind of test do you use? Do you use any power test or speed test, like you mentioned? Which categories do you use?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, to answer this question, there's a whole myriad of tests that you can use, right? So you
That's
have to
it. Yeah.
firstly again going back to the demands of the sport, you can I guess bucket or categorize certain physical qualities. So for example, when it comes to power, the most typical test that you're probably going to be using is obviously a counter movement jump. I like using also a single leg counter movement jump as well. I know there's a bit of a debate. I listened to a podcast recently on Rob Pacey podcast, but there was someone saying that he wasn't a big fan of single leg counter movement jump, but I'm a big fan of it because I think that the strategies that you use on one leg compared to two legs are completely different, right? So
Different.
I've
Yeah.
yeah, I've measured in my experience, I've measured sometimes people who can achieve great CMJ numbers, but when it comes to jumping off one leg, they really struggle to do it. Whether that be because of maybe the increased proprioceptive demands, or they're just the actual skill element of being able to
Just
jump
the
off one leg.
skill. Yeah.
It
Just the
yeah, it
skill of
just
that.
it
Yeah.
changes completely, right? So yeah, I think it's really important to screen that, and also the fact that it's a great test to actually measure knee function as well, compared to a counter movement jump. Like obviously you can get some asymmetry measures, but again, it's not the same as a single leg jump, right?
Yeah.
And then in terms of reactive strength, I like using the 10-5 hop test. So for listeners that aren't aware, it's 10 jumps, 10 pogo style jumps on some force plates or contact mat, and you can get uh, the RSI, which is the reactive strength index. So usually it'll be the flight time divided by the contact time, and it takes the best, or the average of the best 5 jumps. That's why it's called the 10-5 hop test. And I
Yeah.
like using that as a measure of reactive strength. I think many sports require high levels of
This quality.
reactive
That's it.
strength.
Yeah.
Yeah, whether that be for obviously max velocity sprinting or acceleration, whether that be change direction. We know that those 3 components are very highly correlated to high numbers in reactive strength index. But also in terms of, for example, like when it comes to fighters like boxing or MMA or things like that, that ability to be able to sort of go in and out of range is very, and perform that quickly is quite important. So yeah, RSI I think for me is definitely you have to definitely measure that, provided that your sport is demanding some of those qualities.
Yeah.
In terms of maximal strength, again, I know there's a big debate between isometric mid-thigh pull and belt squat. Personally, I've used the mid-thigh pull predominantly, but recently I've been looking and just hearing some different debates about the belt squat. And for example, I was actually talking to Lucas Gamish, who he was one of the presenters at the
Yeah.
Val conference. He's from France. Yeah, he was saying like the belt squat actually, you can get up to more than 50% greater force production than the mid-thigh pull,
Yeah.
which again just sort of opened up a few cogs in my brain about
Yeah.
like
Because of the
if we're
grip and everything. Yeah.
yeah, like if the objective is to actually measure
Power.
peak force
Force.
production,
Yeah.
which is essentially what we're trying to measure, yeah, I guess why wouldn't you be going for a belt squat, for example? Like where if the belt squat is actually providing you with
Higher values. Yeah.
50% more force production. So it's just something to consider when you're choosing some of these strength tests, right? So these are all tests again that can be conducted on force plates. Obviously, if you didn't have force plates, then generally you're probably going to be doing some kind of RM max testing, things of that nature. And then what else is there? When it comes to like injury resilience, so I guess those are the 3 sort of key components. You have your power, reactive strength, and then your maximal strength. And then similar to what you were saying about individualizing testing protocols, this is where you can really get individual
The whole
with
picture.
what you want to
Yeah.
monitor. Yeah, because now if you want to measure various joint strengths, for example, maybe we want to measure groin because it's important in game of football, for example. Like we know there's a very high occurrence of adductor injuries in football, so we want to maybe develop some kind of testing battery that involves monitoring or screening for groin strength. So we might use a groin strength a groin squeeze and hip abduction test at 60 degrees hip flexion. We might also use like a long lever
Yeah.
test where we had the leg straight to also measure that capacity. We could measure obviously calf strength. Again, is very very. If you get a calf injury, it's very complex to actually generally quite more
To
difficult
recap
than
though, yeah.
more difficult to rehab than what people expect, right? So yeah, again, having maybe if you're working in football, for example, having a calf screening protocol, whether that be using a seated ankle plantar flexion test or using what I've done previously as well is using some of the Alex Montera's run specific isometric tests to measure the calf capacity as well. I've found that generally get some good results from using some of those tests. And then obviously, those tests are all done on if you have access to force frame, for example, from Valve, right?
Yeah.
But again, if you don't have these equipment, which many practitioners listening probably might not be lucky enough to have access to this type of stuff, then again, in my experience, I've also used other forms of testing. For example, you can easily test someone's groin strength just by maybe using like a standard Copenhagen.
Animal. Yeah.
Copenhagen, or even like a blood pressure cuff.
Yeah.
Always struggle to say the name of the thing, but it's the blood pressure cuff where you can squeeze the
I know
the device.
what
It
you
gives you
mean.
a value. Or for example, if you want to measure hamstring strength, I know that these days, for example, if you want to measure something similar to a Nordic on the Nord board, you can actually get the My Jump Lab app and then look at if you put someone in a Nordic eccentric Nordic position, you can measure the angle at which they
like a
start to
breaking point.
deteriorate. The angle of the breaking point.
Test.
So although you can't get the actual force values, I guess if you want to see maybe improvements in eccentric hamstring strength, you can look at the angle of
how long he's falling down and when he's breaking. It's a good point.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, and on that point, like if you're measuring hamstring strength on the Nord board, the eccentric hamstring strength, one cue that I like to use as well, which some listeners may not be aware of, is like starting or actually rapidly falling and then decelerating towards the end of the Nordic, right? Because you're actually not going to be getting your peak force values at the start. We know that
because you are going slowly down, like you are increasing.
Yeah.
When you are
so one advantage of that is that by sort of telling the athlete to pull on the brakes at the end, you can actually get much higher peak force values on the eccentric Nordic test, but also you can get a more accurate measure of eccentric rate of force development, which are again two critical components when it comes to maybe mitigating some hamstring injury risk. So I hope that sort of answers this question about how I structure testing. So to I guess provide a summary of all that is choosing some of the key rocks. I like to use the term key rocks that your sport needs and things that you need to test, and then choosing the little pebbles at the end, picking out the little pebbles to actually individualize and really screen for what the athlete really needs.
No, the whole answer is it's amazing because you provide the people like high technical solutions or like with the wall equipment and with the whole force plate thing, but you also provide me and listeners with examples of how they can test it without the equipment. So I think this is something that is quite important, especially for our coaches in Croatia. I will just give one example from our side, and also I will just finish with something. But a lot of clubs don't have here the possibility to test with those equipment because they are, I don't know, still don't using it. So they are on a low level with the assessment. So this kind of solution that you provide are amazing. But I will also like to use this opportunity to invite those clubs and people who are working in those clubs who are listening that we have those equipment. And if you want to test your athletes, players, and you want to participate into a research with us, with Ultrax and with Wild Equipment, you just can contact us and we can do it. And I will get back to the example with the cough and those testing that you mentioned. We test like four clubs here in Croatia, female, male, with Nordics, force plates, and force frame, and we noticed that a lot of them have a problem with producing the force within the calf region, and the values were so low, and this was something that came on our mind, and especially the second part was RFD in eccentric component, the fast component, and these two things were something. Okay, maybe clubs and we need to focus more on developing those things, like you said. And when we are talking about rehab and testing for performance and testing for rehab, because when you were talking about it, you mentioned some tests for the rehab, some tests for performance. So are there any differences when you are approaching to test selection and variable selection when it comes to rehab and when it comes to performance?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, again, this is something that I maybe forgot to mention before, but like, yeah, testing, um, yeah, you can actually divide testing into subcategories of like maybe the purpose of testing might be for performance. We want to look at changes in physical performance. Maybe also on the other side of the spectrum, we're looking at return to performance, right? So rather than actually like I guess one of the definitions of rehab is actually rather than just ensuring the rehab doesn't end when the injury gets better. The rehab ends when the person returns to performance. So
That's it.
On the flip side, yeah, testing for return to performance is critical. So some of the, I guess, key things that I would say are different between testing for performance and testing for rehab would be that when it comes to testing for rehab, you're going to be maybe testing a little bit more regularly than testing for performance. So again, we know that if you want to run a whole testing battery, it's not necessarily like a easy thing to do. You might only have like one or two, maybe even three time points throughout the year where you conduct some tests on a specific day. But when it comes to return to performance, because you might have the athlete in a more of a one-to-one sort of basis, you can actually perform tests a lot more regularly. So I guess in terms of that's a key thing to keep in mind. The second thing when it comes to some of the differences would be that when we're looking at return to performance metrics, we're going to be probably selecting metrics that involve more strategy based. So when we're selecting metrics on a counter movement jump, for example, we might have performance-based metrics, things like your jump height, your contraction time, maybe even RSI mod. These are all like performance-based metrics, okay?
Yeah.
But we might also have strategy-based metrics. So this might be things like impulse, or it might be peak eccentric velocity. So these are all metrics that are looking at how the athlete performed the jump, rather than what the athlete did. So by understanding the how of how that athlete performed a jump, for example, we can then answer the question of why did that occur. So then we can dive deeper into some of that information, and you might even want to be looking back at some of those force traces on the counter moving jump if you have access to force plates.
Yeah.
Right. Even if you don't have force plates, one easy strategy that you can actually do is just break it down in everyone probably has an iPhone these days, or some kind of camera that measures in slow motion, right? So just by actually looking at it you might record a jump in real time and also a jump in slow motion. And then you can actually just visually see like how that athlete is performing the jump. And then if you, again, don't have access to force plates, you can record a couple of different jumps as well over the course of the rehab and see how that changes. You can physically see this athlete might be jumping or might be providing more intent during that eccentric phase. Now, we know that the more intent you have during the eccentric phase, the better the outcome of the jump, right?
That's it.
Because
Yeah.
you're producing more force and into the ground,
Impulse
you're
is
overcoming
higher and everything else. Yeah.
impulse is high, you're overcoming the gravity a lot better. So yeah, I think those are probably some of the key differences there when it comes to um, testing for rehab versus testing for performance. I guess back to my first point as well, like the different timeframes. Although I said, maybe you're a club or organization that performs some of these testing batteries on these big testing batteries on just 1 or 2 days. Now, obviously, sometimes that's not very practical when it comes to the time constraints in sport. Like most practitioners would generally agree that when you're working in sport, you're going to be pretty time poor and you're always constrained for time. So there's that whole concept of invisible monitoring, right? Where you test, but without actually having a testing day. So this is something that I have implemented a lot in my time as a practitioner, I would say. Just not actually dedicating, well, I want to say dedicating, but like not actually having days of just testing, but also like
Yeah.
you can get so much data just by monitoring on a weekly
Just from
basis
training
as well.
sessions.
Yeah. For example, like if you have GPS data, if you want to see, rather than testing 30-minute sprint, you can probably get a lot of that information, a 30 or 40-minute sprint. You can get a lot of information about whether or not your athletes are running faster just by looking at weekly analysis of the maximal velocities that you're achieving during the season, or whether that be preseason or in-season, whatever. You can look at the percentage of max velocity and see that trend over a period of time. Or even things like, your counter movement jumping, you can probably do that as a neuromuscular test, like every week, and you can again see the trends. Like, for example, maybe your jump height might not necessarily change that much over 1 or 2 weeks, but over a longer period of time, you can monitor other things like peak power and things like that are sensitive more to longer term changes. So yeah, those are some so I guess providing the timeframes of when to test. The fact that you can test regularly. Sometimes as well, you can also embed testing within an athlete's training session. Again, something that I've done a lot of the time working as a strength and conditioning coach is another easy way to get your testing done is just by putting maybe some tests in the warm up. Okay,
that's a great example.
The athlete, finish the movement preparation, get that work done, and then after that movement preparation, we're going to do some testing, and then after your testing, we're going to go and do some weight training. So yeah, just some examples of how to integrate that testing into a system that can be. I guess one of the big things about testing is that you need to be ensuring that these tests are, easy to conduct, firstly, but also, they're reproducible as well. Things that you can just do regularly and collect data over a long period of time. That's very important. And again, a big part of my philosophy as well when it comes to testing.
Yeah, especially if you can use those testing procedures and put them in training sessions, because we are using the same movements in training sessions. Why not to collect the data, like you said, from mid-type pulls? It's a great strength and activation exercise, but we can still get some data. Or when doing hamstring Nordics, why not get data from that part? So it can be a organized warm-up for collecting data, but still preparing for the training session. And I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because it took me to the topic of monitoring, and you already mentioned some variables and strategies, what to monitor and what to track during the week. But to ask you, besides monitoring for readiness on force plates, Nordics, and these kind of things that we can use on a daily basis also, are there any more strategies that you are using for checking the responses from the training sessions, from your athletes or players? So are there any other methodologies like RP methodology, subjective methodologies, or when it comes to monitoring, what's your philosophy?
Yeah, I think when it comes to, I'm actually a big fan of the subjective monitoring. I know it's like not
The
like
same.
yeah, like I think as coaches we're always caught up with the numbers and all that kind of stuff, but like I use I've used RPE a lot with my athletes. I find that that's a good way to monitor training load in environments where you might not have access to GPS, for example. Um, Even environments like when you're working with fighters, like fighters, you can't get. Well, one of the big
GPS
differences
data.
about monitoring load with fighters is, yeah, there's no like
Yeah,
GPS. Like you can't actually. It's very difficult to monitor training load. And the thing with fighters is that like they like to train hard. Like I don't know if you understand a lot about fighters, but like the problem with them is that
yeah,
you have to stop them from doing too much because they just want to train all the time. Uh,
they like to train hard like all
yeah,
the time, like you said. Yeah,
yeah. You don't really get lazy fighters. Like it's very difficult to find one. So yeah, I
yeah,
guess yeah. One thing that I've used is actually I've created like I guess RPE questionnaires that I send a link to an athlete. They can fill it out on their phone, and this will be uploaded to like a Google Sheets, and then
yeah,
I have like created some dashboards that help me to monitor load for these guys. But also like in terms of the usefulness of RPE, uh, we know that subjectively, like we need to also monitor the internal responses for the athlete, how the athlete is perceiving that load, and then match that to whether or not this is, I guess, congruent to what they're experiencing uh, using some of those external load metrics, things like your high speed running meters, or you know things like number of acceleration, change direction, things like that. Um, and yeah, I guess always thinking about how we can integrate those two things together. I think that's key. Like when it comes to monitoring training load, I know there's we like to make it very complex, but it's essentially just monitoring
yeah,
something about your external load, your output, and then something about your internal load, whether that be your heart rate or things like RPE. Um,
yeah.
so
Like two parts of the equation. So what is the load that he
yeah,
performed, and we put on him, and what is the response according to that load, and that's it. So
exactly,
the response
exactly.
from the internal part, from the muscles, from the lungs, heart, and anything like this. But yeah, like you said, subjective grades are still amazing thing to use, and we can have, I don't know, 10 kilometers in football. I'm just giving an example, 700 meters of something, but it doesn't tell me what this means for the athlete. But if he gives me 7, 8, or he's feeling fresh when the game is coming, this is a good information for me. So it's not good if I'm seeing that 2 days before a game, his wellness score or shape is like quite low. He's not sleeping well. He feels tired. He gave me high RP values. So this is something that I don't want to see a day before a game. And this is something that Martin Boucher and colleagues just published before, I think, 2 days, 3 days on his
Mhm.
on his magazine. They used two different sets of data. Well, they use machine learning for the interpretation, but the conclusion was, yeah, fresh players and ready players will be better performers on games. So it doesn't really matter how much you run. Well, that's yeah. Well, the like good point, because you don't need to run too much or more to win a game. So this is something that they wanted
100%.
to conclude here, and that's it. But yeah, you have bigger problem when it comes to martial arts and fighters. It's hard to get this load variable and responses from the training sessions and matches. So yeah, you're a little bit more complex here than we in football.
Yeah, just on
Yeah,
that as well. I think one of the honestly one of the best questions you can ask an athlete is like, "How are you feeling today?" Like such a basic question, but like you can get
Yeah, and you can see
so
him. Yeah,
much
that's it.
you can get so much information about the athlete just from that one question. Like you ask an athlete, how are they feeling? How are they feeling today? Sometimes they just say, yeah, good. Okay, well, if they're good, then yeah, we'll just go training as
Yeah,
normal.
let's
But
continue. Yeah, that's
yeah,
it.
but sometimes they'll be like, I just struggled to sleep last night, or I've had a lot of exams. If you're a student, for example, like then we can start adjusting on the fly because a lot of the time, I'm sure many coaches who are listening will understand is like, yeah, we can have the best plan in the world, but how many times have you wrote up a plan, but you've just actually never actually followed that
This is
plan
what
to the
I'm
T?
talking
So
about. Yeah, that's
yeah,
it.
like you have to be very good at adapting on the fly because yeah, you just don't know how that athlete is going to be coming in on a particular day or how that athlete is going to be responding from a particular session. Unfortunately, we just as much as we like to measure all these things, it's part of being the human physiology. Like it's very unpredictable. So
Yeah,
yeah, obviously we need to have that big picture plan. I'm not saying that we should not have go into training with no plan at all, but we need to have a plan that's very flexible.
yeah,
Having a flexible plan is very important. And yeah, like understanding, what exactly we want to get out of the program, but also respecting that chances are, or pretty much 99% of the time, you're probably going to be changing that plan. So um, yeah, it's important to keep that in mind. And yeah, just asking a question about how that athlete is feeling on that day will open up so many questions. And I think it actually,
yeah, that's it.
although
But
it's
that's good.
although it's not on a spreadsheet, like you're going to be getting the quality of information is so much better than just a number about sleep or a number about nutrition. Like you actually maybe it provides you with some potential avenues for education for that athlete as well. Educating if the athletes just really they're reported that they're just struggling to sleep. Like a number is going to tell you something, but like if you actually you know have this conversation with the athlete about sleep, you're going to be potentially helping them more in terms of improving their performance. So yeah, those are just some of my views on using some of the subjective measures when it comes to training load.
Yeah, and I really like what you said, and it get back to like you need to have the methodology, but also you need to have some tool to check how this methodology is going, like the responses from the athlete, and you're just following those reactions, and you are adjusting your training session with the flexible periodization, or call it whatever you want. And yeah, this is something where also the I think the world of sports, but also the methodologies in football are going into that direction. Like we are moving a little bit away from the classical block systems of programming, like we are following this program for 6 weeks and these kind of things, but we are checking more the responses of the players. And but this brings me to, well, we are indirectly constantly covering a little bit topics of strength training, during our conversation, and I would like to dive more into this topic, to see how you are training strength and how you approach to strength, and we can start like the difference between I like it, so I ask a lot of questions about it because I'm quite interested in, let's say strength training for fighters and strength training for team athletes, like team sport athletes, like basketball and fighters. How do you approach to programming strength?
Yeah, I mean that's we could have probably an hour conversation about this topic and strength, but yeah, I
It's
guess
a
when it
it's
comes to
that it's a topic that we can talk like the whole day. Yeah.
yeah yeah um, yeah, I guess when it comes to strength, for me, like we know that there's going to be, I guess, a cap of when developing strength is going to be maybe possibly like it's there's going to be a point where the gains we have in strength are not going to directly link to performance. Okay, so unless you're maybe a power lifter or Olympic lifter, things like that, where the actual strength is like how to describe it, like the actual skill of the sport is about strength, right? Then we probably don't need to be focusing uh, all our attention to strength. Does that make sense? So like we're going to be also
Yeah,
including
totally.
other aspects of the sports demands. I think I think these days it's a lot better, but sometimes we'll still see people that are just purely focused on that, like squat, bench, deadlift, like those are all things that I'm going to include in my program usually, but it's important to understand that it's not going to be like the king of, helping an athlete become a beast when it comes to the pitch, right? Like in the football context, or again, having great strength is very important, but and yeah, it's going to be. We know that stronger athletes tend to be injured less, but once the athlete has, I guess, hit that minimum standard that we need to get
Level. Yeah.
for them, yeah, the minimum standard they need to get for strength, then I usually question, okay, what does this athlete need next? So that might be uh, things like speed training, or it might be rate of force development, it might be power. It's not to say that these things are not included before they reach that capacity in strength, that minimum standard. These are all things that we're going to include in that program, even though they might not be strong enough. But once they get to that point in strength, then we're going to be, maybe diverting some of that attention of strength to some of these other components that are going to be maybe more, I guess, directly specific and transferable to the sports demands. Does that make sense? So, and that might be even as well,
Yeah.
like actually allocating more time for skill development. I've had some athletes who I've trained for a long time, and they just got to a point where like they were just physical beasts in the gym. So for me, it was
Yeah.
like, okay, like they are just such freak athletes in the gym, but like now is a time for them to actually dedicate more time to skill development, for example. So that's another point to consider, is that like, once an athlete has that level of strength, is to maybe you could potentially reduce the amount of sessions they do in the gym to allocate more time for skill development, because at the end of the day, that's going to be what's going to be the difference when it comes to their performance. It's not how much they can squat or deadlift in the gym, it's how many goals can they score. So if they're better at
That's it. Yeah.
finishing and they spend more
Yep.
time finishing, and maybe doing those little extras that's going to help them score more goals, then that's going to make your organization more successful, because you have a striker, for example, who's put more time in on the pitch to improve his finishing ability.
Scoring
So
goals, and that's it. Yeah. More skill.
yeah, when it comes to I guess my philosophy in strength training, that's sort of where my head's at. Like,
I would think.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of
I like it.
just having, yeah,
I like it when I talk with my students and coaches who are in our program. This is how we try to explain them the strength, because also here I'm constantly comparing this the way of thinking in Croatia, but I think it's good because we have a lot of listeners from this part. Is that when it comes to strength, they usually think like, yeah, strength is everything. We need to put like more kilograms and these kind of things. But like I like the approach, like you said, hey, we need to hit the minimal level or some kind of a level that will keep the athlete safe, and then let's go working on different qualities like RFDs, speed, skill, or something like that. And
exactly.
but what this brings me to a little bit more back to things that you mentioned about discovering where is that level. So do you have? I know maybe it's a tricky question. I try to answer this also to myself. Well, I will give you my example. So I like to say, well, if I have an athlete who have 80 kilograms, uh, like something that I try to achieve is like, hey, try to lift in treble deadlift 80 kilograms. This is something that it's a good starting point. Like you need to lift your body weight in that moment, and we can progress a little bit more about that. And this is something what like okay, this is the that level that it's enough. Let's go to develop something else. So how do you have any specific also measure for that? Where is that level? Or let's say in mid-type pull or in trap bar deadlifts or something like that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. When it comes to standards, I guess the first thing to do is to actually look at some of the research that's out there. These days, yeah, there's lots about relative standards, and even Valve themselves, they have a lot of normative data.
Normative
So
data, yeah.
yeah, I would firstly go to those sources and just have a brief overview of what good strength, for example, if we're on the topic of strength, what good strength and what kind of numbers do some professional level athletes hit, maybe some semi-professional and amateur. It depends on the context, right? For me, like I think one of the best ways, if you're working with like your amateur level or just lower level athletes, I think it's always good to show them uh, those elite level numbers when it comes to things like strength, right? Because then they have a objective. Okay, this is how far I need to go, especially if they're athletes who really aspire to get to that top level. This is how far I need to go to get to that point, right? So, yeah, have a look at the normative data first. From there, once you
Yeah.
start collecting testing data, you're probably going to have a good data set of like of what good numbers should look like. So that, for me, I would say that probably take maybe a year or two of collecting data. And then from there, you can also determine some of your standards. Now, in terms of specific numbers, I would say that, for example, an isometric mid-fly pull, I would say for elite level, you're probably going to be hitting about 45 newtons or above per kilo. 45 to 50, I would say, is pretty good for isometric mid-fly pull. Anything above that is like exceptional. But I'd say like to be classified as strong, you probably want to be. This is for strong for like a team sport or a
Yeah.
non-strength based athlete. Yeah, I've typically found that the strongest athletes I've tested are sitting within 45 and 50 and above.
Yeah.
Also, one metric that I look at as well when it comes to isometric mid-fly pull on force plates is the force at 200 milliseconds. So for those that don't know, this is a metric that basically allows you to measure rate of force development, right? So if you think about when you're on a mid-fly pull, okay, I'll count the athlete down, 3, 2, 1, push into the ground. I usually cue push as hard and fast into the ground as
Or
possible.
the fast, yeah.
Hard and fast, because we not only want to be getting that peak strength measure, but we also want to be getting
You
this
want both.
force at 200. Force at
Yeah.
200, because then we can, because it's a discrete value, it's a point at it's a specific point in time. We can measure and monitor this point in time over a period of time. So obviously, if this number at 200 milliseconds is increasing, we can make the assumption, provided that you are testing in a standardized way, we can make the assumption that this person is improving their rate of force development, because the force at 200 milliseconds is like the initiation of that force production. So the more force they can produce at that initial point, the better they are able to apply force rapidly into the ground. Now, in terms of
Okay, it's a great point.
I guess your traditional lifting numbers, I would say, again, I've typically used like allometric scaling as well. So like we know that the relationship between the load lifted and someone's body weight is not a linear relationship
Yeah.
because the lighter you are, the more relative load you can lift. It's easier for a 50 kilo person to lift 2 times their body weight
Yeah.
versus someone who is 100 kilos to lift 2 times their body weight, which is 200 kilos on the bar. So
Yeah.
you have to take that into consideration when it comes to also looking at the standards of
And body weight. Yeah.
strength. Yeah, but typically I would say for, let's say, an average athlete for males, let's go with maybe 85 or 90 kilo male athlete. I'm typically looking for 1.5 times body weight in the squat, about 2 times body weight on the trap bar, and about 1.05 on a bench press and bench pull. For
Yeah.
females, that's going to be a little bit lower. I would say for typical female athlete, maybe 50 to 60 kilos. It's going to be 1.25 on the squat. It's going to be 1.5 on the trap bar, and it's going to be 0.95 or 95% of their body weight on a bench press or bench pull. So those are some typical numbers that I'm looking to achieve for my
To achieve.
athletes.
Yeah.
Yeah, when it comes to strength standards. So yeah, I hope that answers your question about that.
It answers more than enough because again, I like how you answer. You start from one side, from the more complex equipment, then you go to the traditional like methods, like this one with the example with relative values and kilograms. And it's a good point, and I think that from this episode, the listeners will have a lot of great information because you provide a lot of practical details, examples with the variables, tests, and I think that well that this brings us to the end of the episode because we cover the whole topics of monitoring strength training, testing, and I think this one will be quite when we wrap all things up with a lot of solid and great information and that the people will really enjoy it. And well, I would like to use 2 more minutes for asking you a little bit more about your projects and that for the people who will be listening this is that uh, when it comes to your future projects, what people can expect and where can people can find you. Is it there a possibility that someone contact you on LinkedIn, Instagram, if they have any questions more about this episode?
Yeah, so if people want to follow my work, I predominantly been posting on Instagram. It's coach underscore how. So how is my Chinese name. So it's HAO. Coach underscore how is where you'll find most of my content. Typically been posting videos about my own training. I love training myself. I've been posting parts of my athletes training. And then this is something that I want to do within the near future as well, just posting more about maybe potentially like little dashboards that I create, expanding certain metrics. I'm going to be posting content like this, just me speaking on podcasts about various topics and things like that. So if you want to find more content about myself, that's where you're going to find me, most likely.
Great, that's amazing. People will reach you then there on the Instagram, and they can follow again what you've been working on. And is there any advice for young coaches or someone? Well, you're also a young coach, but young
Yeah.
coach with a lot of experience in the background. But someone who's starting after university, some advice that maybe when you were in their positions, you would like to hear. So, is there anything that you would like to recommend for them on their journey?
Yeah, for any young practitioners out there who want to get started in the how do I describe this? The minefield of sports performance.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I think get started as early as possible. Like for me, I think
that's
one of
good.
the best
Yeah,
one of the best things that I did was I just started working with people. Like didn't matter who. It was people were like general populations, people, the elderly, young kids, just get involved. Like you're going to learn so much in terms of like how to communicate with people. That's the main thing. I think working in sport, you need to be able to have good communication. So it doesn't matter what you know. Like you can know everything about strength training, everything about plyometrics, GPS monitoring, whatever. But at the end of the day, if you can't communicate that information, then and you can't like coach someone to improve just a basic movement like a squat, for example, then you're not going to be. Unfortunately, you're probably not going to be like a good coach. So you have to, just get your hands dirty, get involved because if you want
Totally
to work
agree.
with
Yeah.
these, if you want to work with these elite athletes, the margins for making error is going to be more significant. Like if you make a mistake working at an EPL club, for example, like the costs are so much greater than working with someone who maybe is just obviously we don't want to be making mistakes, but if you want to be making mistakes, you probably want to be making them in um, a less cost environment where the consequences aren't as great. But you will
Cost and
learn,
benefits.
you will learn so much from those lessons about how to load someone effectively or things to put in your program, things not to put in the program at certain time points. So that'd be the main message that I would give to young practitioners. And again, if you're a young practitioner listening and you want some help, you're always welcome to message me on Instagram or find me on LinkedIn. I'm always willing to help the next generation as well. So yeah.
That's amazing, Hassan, and thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed discussing with you. Well, it's like I'm checking now on the timing. It's like hour and a half we are talking, and it just passed like crazy fast, And
Yeah.
I think that everybody who will listening this will get and will hear a lot of amazing information. So from my side, thank you one more time for being here with us. I hope that you also enjoyed in this episode like I did.
Yeah, it was great to be on. And yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a really good discussion. We discussed so many topics, and really love sharing my views on those things.
Yeah, perfect. I wish you all the best in your future projects. I hope that we should definitely stay in touch because we have a lot of dots that are like the way of thinking that is similar, and I think we can continue working like in that direction and maybe on some future projects. And I wish you all the best in yours. And again, for everybody who is listening to this, follow our YouTube channel, follow our Instagram. We will have now quite soon, like in 2 weeks, we will have an episode in GPS using of GPS in team environment in 2 weeks, like a webinar. So everybody who is listening, you can join us for that topic. It will be 3 hours of discussing just about GPS. And in 1 month, we will have a webinar with Johan Lundberg, who is educator of physical conditioning at Football Federation of Sweden. So these are some of upcoming projects with us. And yeah, hope to see you all on that events. And Hassan, one more time, thank you and good luck.
Thanks, mate.